When you play a lot of video games like I do, it's inevitable that some will fade from your mind pretty quickly. But other times, a special game comes along that sticks with you, constantly in the back of your mind for days, weeks, months, or even years. One such game to have this effect on me is Returnal. I recently went back to the game after a few years and fell in love all over again. So in today's video, I want to talk about what makes Returnal such a masterpiece and why I think it is still one of the very best experiences you can get on PlayStation 5. Returnal comes from now Sony-owned first-party team Housemarque, who are probably most famous for the Super Stardust games and their PS4 launch title, Resogun. Or maybe you know them from the PS3 and Xbox 360 port of Angry Birds Trilogy. Yes, I'm not kidding, they actually developed that. For those who aren't super familiar with them, a typical Housemarque game is pretty easy to spot from their 2D arcade shoot-'em-up gameplay style, which typically features a whole lot of different particles and effects flying across the screen. But for Housemarque's first foray into the 9th generation of consoles, they would be trying something a bit different. From Returnal's very first reveal, it was clear this would be a level-up moment for the studio. The game would go fully 3D, and seemed to have a much larger budget than any of their prior games. Another big change would be a move to the roguelike genre, an aspect of Returnal that we'll cover more in depth later. Returnal was released on April 30th, 2021, and was a significant release for Sony as one of the first true PS5 exclusives without a cross-gen PS4 version. I bought it at that time and quickly became absolutely enamored with it. Let's talk about why. The game stars Celine, a pilot for Astra Corporation. She is drawn off course by a strange signal known as the White Shadow. She ends up crash landing and finds herself stranded, quickly realizing that every time she dies, she experiences the crash all over again. So now, Celine must fight her way through the planet and find a way to somehow break the cycle. Returnal's story is deeply strange and mind-bending. It's one of those storylines that requires a couple YouTube video essays to fully understand what you even just saw. But it works, and the mystery of it all leaves you always wanting more, yearning for the next story beat to add some new context to everything around you. While the story is nice, the true selling point of Returnal is of course its combat. And although it may seem like your typical third-person shooter on the surface, the deep intricacies will quickly begin to show. The first is the overload system. Guns in Returnal don't have ammo, they simply overheat after too many shots. After overheating, you can wait out the timer or go for the active reload prompt. If timed correctly, your gun will automatically reload and allow you to get back to fighting faster. This is very important as the enemies in Returnal are relentless and taking them out sooner rather than later will always be beneficial. Another way to kill enemies quicker is with the alt-fire abilities. Each weapon you pick up will feature a randomized alt-fire ability, able to send out some heavy damage. The last thing to keep in mind is the adrenaline system. This grants the player buffs for each enemy killed without taking damage. Throughout the 5 different adrenaline levels, the player will gain a wider window to time their reloads, increased melee damage, or even the ability to take one free hit. All of these different elements combine to add a unique micromanaging aspect to the game as you try to keep track of your status and various cooldowns. It can make combat feel very hectic and overwhelming, but also unbelievably satisfying when you can nail it. In terms of the enemies you'll be fighting with these abilities, they range from alien-like creatures to robots, with most choosing to attack with projectiles. And it's with these projectiles that the Housemarque specialty begins to shine through. They were able to perfectly transition their bullet hell style into the 3rd dimension, with enemies shooting wide arrays of flashy projectiles across your screen, requiring precise movement and dodging. The best example of this, and the example I show to anyone who needs to be sold on Returnal, is the game's second boss fight. This fight was the moment I went from enjoying Returnal to being absolutely obsessed with it. The fight is hypnotizing as Ixion flies around the screen, sending out different formations of projectiles. At times, it can feel like you're watching a light show on the 4th of July. This fight was extremely tough and took me many tries. It really does require full focus, and it's one of those moments where everything around you washes away and all you can see is the game. It's a level of true immersion that we all hope for. Returnal is able to capture this feeling so spectacularly, not only during boss fights like this, but throughout the entirety of the game. When you aren't sweating out tough enemy encounters, you'll find yourself engaging with Returnal's trippy storyline, which is primarily told through first-person horror segments taking place in a mysterious house. The PT-esque horror segments can be pretty chilling and add to the darkness of the world. While these horror scenes may seem a bit disconnected or random, I don't think Returnal would be the same without them. The added anxiety and discomfort that comes from these house segments carries over to the rest of the game. Suddenly, these enemies you're fighting don't seem like random aliens anymore. They have a much darker, creepier aura about them. Another aspect of Returnal that I find extremely impressive is the audio design. The music is phenomenal, a perfect backdrop for everything happening in the game. It swells just when it needs to, lessens for the rare quiet and peaceful moments, and always adds so much intensity to each encounter. My favorite musical moment comes from the fourth boss, who is playing an instrument, sending his song throughout the level. As you climb the mountain to him, the song gets progressively louder and louder. During the fight, the song becomes deafening. And then, once he's finally defeated, the silence is so rewarding. For Celine, this song was a grating nightmare, and as the player, you started to feel that way as well. And so you share in her relief of the silence. The great sound design doesn't stop with just the music either. The sounds the weapons make are so impactful. My personal favorite sound in the game is the little chime that plays when your alt fire is off cooldown. This may seem like a small detail, but it is actually one of the most important decisions the developers made. This sound cue allows you to never take your eyes off the action. You don't have to check your cooldown progress in the corner of the screen. You can just wait for the sound and you know you're good to go. As you play the game more, you'll become trained by this noise, immediately ready to shoot off your alt fire every time you hear it. The noise manages to be extremely distinct and recognizable without being overly loud and annoying. It goes back to the point I made earlier about immersion. When you really lock in on Returnal and pay attention to all the different systems at play, it's an entrancing experience. As you can tell, I really love this game. I don't think I'll ever forget my first time playing through it. It took me a while, probably around 30 hours of playtime across several weeks. I think a big reason why it stands out for me is I'm not usually one who enjoys extremely difficult games, but something about this one just clicked. I still remember the feeling of losing a good run and closing the game in frustration, thinking I may quit, only to boot the game back up a few minutes later and go again. The determination and time it took to get through it is something that will always stick with me. Finally overcoming it and beating the game was incredibly special, and honestly, one of my favorite modern gaming memories I've had. With all of this said though, Returnal is admittedly far from perfect, and it wouldn't be fair to not cover its flaws in this video as well. First, let's talk about the roguelike aspect. This was the most controversial element of Returnal when it was first released. In general, the roguelike genre seems to be associated with smaller indie games. So when players saw PlayStation releasing a $70 roguelike, it raised some eyebrows. Additionally, there are a lot of people who just simply don't like these kinds of games. I am not one of those people though. I love roguelikes. In fact, my favorite game of all time is The Binding of Isaac. So for me, seeing PlayStation investing in a AAA roguelike was actually a pretty big selling point. However, Returnal is actually not all that strong in the roguelike department. A defining feature of any great roguelike is the progression you gain throughout runs. Ideally, the player should always feel like they are gaining or earning something, even if they die. Hades is probably the best example of this. Every time you die in Hades, you can upgrade your stats and abilities. So even the worst players will eventually be able to make it through the game simply because they will have so many buffs from their various runs. Returnal, however, doesn't really have this. There are a few things that carry over, with the most important one being the fact that you don't need to kill any boss more than once. There are some new items that can be unlocked, and there was one currency that carries over between runs, but that's about it. Some new items or new weapons you'll unlock along the way are better than others, but not enough to make the game significantly easier if you're struggling. I think this is the main reason why so many people felt too frustrated to make it through the game. It's already annoying enough when you die in a roguelike and have to restart, but it's even worse when you feel like it was all for absolutely nothing. And with no systems in place to make Celine stronger between runs, the only way to really improve is just to get better through more runs and more deaths. There are some other roguelike aspects of Returnal that miss the mark for me. For example, the rooms themselves are not randomly generated, as is often the case in this genre. Instead, there is a set number of rooms that will then appear randomly. And although no run feels exactly the same, the room variety isn't large enough. You will very quickly notice the room formats and their patterns. And while this is certainly true for any roguelike game if you play them long enough, that will usually take quite a bit of playtime to pick up on. In Returnal, it will probably only take you a couple runs to notice. I think the main reason for this is that Returnal was attempting to tell a deeper narrative than most games in this genre, meaning they had to make sure certain set pieces, moments, and enemies were seen at the right time. It would be hard to tell the story they wanted to tell with completely random rooms and boss encounters, but this decision can make runs feel very repetitive. The final complaint I have is more of an observation, but it's something that I think may have legitimately blocked many people from finishing the game. Returnal is split into two separate halves. The first half is biomes 1, 2, and 3. Once you clear biome 3, you reach what is essentially a permanent checkpoint. Once here, you must clear biomes 4, 5, and 6 to complete the game. My issue here is that I find the first half of the game to be significantly harder than the second half. In particular, the bosses of biomes 2 and 3 are the hardest by far in my opinion, way harder than even the very final boss. When I first played the game 4 years ago, I kinda thought this was just because I had gotten better at the game over time, or had stumbled upon an overpowered weapon. But when playing it again for this video, I had the exact same experience. I still find myself dying to the second boss often when I face him. It took me multiple attempts over a few nights to get through biome 3. But then the second half of the game was a breeze, getting through it with only 1 or 2 deaths. The final boss is really my biggest sticking point. It is shockingly easy. I remember thinking, oh okay, here comes phase 2, because that could not have been it. But then the game just ends. I'm not kidding when I say some of these standard enemies I faced throughout biome 6 gave me more trouble than the actual final boss itself. After having such a strenuous and difficult journey to reach him, it ends up feeling pretty anticlimactic. Returnal definitely has some pacing issues, and it's a shame because a lot of the players probably got stuck in the first half and never got to see the rest of the game. But these are pretty much the only complaints I have about Returnal, and as I reflect on what I wrote, it seems like most of the struggles come from the roguelike genre. Housemarque put themselves in a tough position with this, attempting to make a roguelike game that still felt AAA and featured a definitive story. In the end, they had some missteps through that goal, but it was never enough to ruin my personal enjoyment of the game. In some weird ways, these mistakes may have actually added to the experience, and that feeling of reaching the mountaintop I felt every time I overcame the next obstacle. But that can't be an excuse, especially because I know for a fact these problems were one of the main reasons why many found themselves not enjoying the game or unable to finish it. As I wrap up, I'll say this. Returnal is not a game for everyone. It asks a lot out of you. It asks you to be okay with starting over. It asks you to be okay with being frustrated and confused. And most of all, it asks you to be okay with getting your ass beat. For some, all of this is too much to ask, and I completely understand. But for others who are able and willing to play by Housemarque's rules, a truly unmatched gaming experience is waiting for you. Returnal is not a perfect game, but I struggle to think of many that have left more of a lasting impression on me. If you're someone who enjoys intense action games or difficult games in general, I think you will be hard-pressed to find anything better than Returnal. If you did try Returnal in the past and couldn't get into it, I would urge you to try again with the mindset and mentality I laid out in this video. And if it's still not for you, that's okay. Maybe keep an eye on Housemarque's next game, Saros, instead. Based on the limited info we've heard so far, it looks like that game's primary goal is to bring back all the best aspects of Returnal while directly addressing its weak points, such as the lack of progression between runs. That sounds like a recipe for success, and I cannot wait to see more. I hope you enjoyed this video on Returnal. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it helps out the channel a ton. And I would love to hear about your personal experience with Returnal in the comments below. Thanks for watching.